Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is your host, Kyle Buller, and today on the show, I have the honor to sit down with Rick Doblin in person. This interview took place the Sunday before the conference officially got started. I guess there was probably some workshops and such going on at that time. But we chat about the excitement around the conference, the huge growth that they've seen over the years. I think that Rick was saying that they sold around 12,000 tickets. So there was more than 12,000 people at Psychedelic Science this year, which is crazy to think about. And if you went, I hope you had a wonderful time. I know our team did, and it was really, really fun. So thank you, MAPS, for putting on this really great event and conference. And, it was just really fun to get to meet everybody, all these online relationships, and finally getting to meet up in person. In this episode, we chat about some news that MAPS just received a $5 million grant from the Cohen Foundation, and also the Patient Access Fund that will be created. We talk about the second phase 3 study. We talk about MDMA and group therapy. We talk about a topic that I found really interesting, but MDMA with adolescents and teens and PTSD. And that might be a study that's coming down the pipeline in the future, which, I find fascinating. So this is a really fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And if you were at Psy Science, well, maybe it's a nice little trip down memory lane before the conference gets going here. So if you like this episode, remember to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and be sure to follow us on social media. We're on all the social media platforms, so if you want to stay up to date, give us a follow over there. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you enjoyed this episode with Rick Doblin, and we will catch you on the other side. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Psychedelics Today, Rick Doblin. I think this is your second time on the podcast, and this is pre-conference. So how are you feeling?
I'm feeling super excited about what's been happening. It's astonishing. I'm a little bit anxious about my talk, which I still need to prepare. But overall, we have been just astonished at the fact that we now have 11,500 people registered for this conference. And we, in our wildest dreams, thought maybe we'd get up to 10,000, but even that was just like a wild dream. The largest psychedelic conference that's ever happened was our Psychedelic Science in 2017.
And that was a little over 3,000, right?
Yeah. So now we're almost 4 times as big. It's a whole different cultural moment.
Yeah.
And what I didn't fully anticipate is how this conference would be like a magnet for the entire community. That's what we hoped for.
Right.
But there's all sorts of activities around. And the part that I was dreaming of but wasn't sure what happened is that our opening ceremony is going to have the governor of Colorado.
Oh, amazing.
And then
Jared Polis, correct?
Jared Polis, yeah. And then once he agreed to come, I felt that it was really important that we have a bipartisan opening, just as a symbol for what we're really doing, that we're trying to bring this again into the culture, out of the culture wars. And so we have the former Texas governor, Rick Perry.
Oh, amazing.
And then because we want to work into the National Institutes of Health and the sort of the mainstream in that way, we have the Josh Gordon, who's the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. So he's coming as well. So we have this opening. This is astonishing. Yeah. And there's just so many. There's a group of a meeting for funders that's got over 100, funders that are coming. There's, I think, the most prevalent category of people that are coming is therapists.
Yeah.
Because they're really interested in how they can, further help their patients in the future.
I think the first MAPS conference I've been to was in 2013. And I think that was around like 1,500 people. So like, what's it been like the past?
That was 1,900, I think.
19?
Yeah, I think that was 1,900.
Yeah. What's it been like to watch the growth in this field over the past like decade or so?
Well, it's just been so satisfying. I mean, part of the growth has been difficult for us in the sense of the rise of all the for-profit companies, because what I had hoped for was that there would be, we would clear out a pathway through the regulatory system, and that then others would want to try to develop psychedelics as well. But I didn't anticipate that there would be hundreds and hundreds of for-profit psychedelic companies.
Yeah.
And I also didn't anticipate how much that would actually make it more difficult for us to raise charitable donations.
Yeah,
for a
how has
while.
that been making it difficult for you guys?
Well, because so many of the people that were in the past willing to donate because that was the only way forward,
Right.
now we're thinking, well, maybe they would invest.
People want their returns in companies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we've seen kind of a rise of, I guess it's this way in any new industry that sort of hits the stock market, that
Right.
unrealistic expectations and valuations went way up, and then the valuations crashed.
Yeah.
Along with, larger macroeconomic conditions. So that made it even harder to raise more donations.
Yeah. Do you see a shift with folks that are looking to invest with that little bit of that crash that happened like a year or so ago?
I think that there's been a difficult time for people to invest in anything these days.
Yeah, that's true.
Although the stock market has been going up. And I think there's a lot of hope that I think a turning point is going to come in a couple months when we publish the results of our second phase 3 study. There was only 2 drugs that were ever given breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA for PTSD. And the other one was this drug Tonmya by Tonix Pharmaceuticals, and that failed in phase 3. And then they did a re-evaluation of their data post hoc after they had the data, and they came up with a new theory of why it might work in a certain group of people, and then it failed again. And so there has been really no successful example of any psychedelic having 2 successful phase 3 studies. And we have announced that our second phase 3 study was very successful.
That's amazing.
But I think once people see the actual data when it comes out in a scientific publication, that will give the whole field this sense, yeah, this can work even within the constraints of working within FDA.
Yeah. Is there anything that you can discuss around that?
Well, just that it was statistically significant, that it was called confirmatory. So our first phase 3 study was remarkably statistically significant, 0.0001. What that means is it's a 1 in 10,000 chance that the findings that we had were random and not due to the MDMA enhancing the psychotherapy. And we also had an excellent safety record in that there was no serious adverse events of suicidality or anything like that in the MDMA group. There was some in the placebo group. And so the second phase 3 study called confirmatory has confirmed our findings. So we also have no serious adverse events. And I think that we've had some good meetings with the FDA, what are called pre-NDA meetings, which are pre-new drug application. And we're pretty much in agreement with the FDA and on the fact that we've got the data, we're going to be filing it.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a real good chance that PTSD sufferers may have a new option for treatment. I think the key challenge for us is going to be properly training therapists.
Yeah. Can you discuss that a little bit more?
Yeah. So I think the proper training of psychedelic therapists is different than the proper training of psychiatrists, to administer any kind of pharmacological drugs.
Yeah.
Because for psychiatry, when they give SSRIs or they give other kinds of medications or they give electroconvulsive therapy or whatever, those are meant to be the treatments. In our case, the treatment is really the human relationship, the therapy, and then the psychedelics make the therapy more effective. And so it makes the most sense for people that are interested in doing psychedelic therapy for them to have the experience of the psychedelics themselves. As we start to scale, there's a lot of experienced trauma therapists, but they might not be experienced psychonauts.
Right.
And it's hard to describe what a drug does. I remember the first time I ever took MDMA, which was back in 1982, and I had been given descriptions of it. I'd seen people doing it, but once I took it, I was just blown away by what it did for me and how I couldn't really have predicted it from what people
reading. Yeah.
No. So I think we've just announced a partnership with Numinous, a company in Canada that is going to be opening up a protocol to therapists to go and receive MDMA as part of their training. And then I'm trying to also work with a company, New Mind, in the Bahamas to do that.
People would be going to the Bahamas to receive that treatment?
Yes.
Oh, that sounds awesome.
Yes. And it's really, really important, but we would never require it.
Right.
I think the important thing is to say is we want to welcome skeptics. We want to welcome people who don't necessarily want to do psychedelics. But what we say is that the experience of MDMA, and this was true for also psilocybin and all the other psychedelics, that the therapists that are going to administer them to patients, they won't be automatically better than all the therapists that have never done it,
Right.
but just they will be better themselves if they've had that experience.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be a challenge for us to figure out how to do that post-approval in the United States, outside of a protocol, ideally, because that's
Right.
now the most expensive part of the training, or not necessarily the most expensive, but there's an initial training that's around 20 or 30 hours of online, and then around 40, 45 hours in person. Then there's the option of receiving MDMA, and then there is the supervision that they get when they work with their first PTSD patient.
And for somebody that would receive MDMA, part of that training, would that be individual care, like having the two therapists there? Or have you looked at like group models to cut down the cost?
Well, we are just now working with Christopher at the Portland, Oregon VA on a group therapy model. And he's hopefully just a few months away from starting. And it will reduce the costs. It's not clear that it will be more effective.
Right.
Part of the healing, I think, is when people are under the influence of MDMA, because in our 8-hour therapy sessions, more or less, it varies with everybody, but more or less around half the time, their eyes are closed, listening to music. They're having this inner experience that's really metaphorical, poetic imagery. It's like storytelling to themselves.
Yeah.
The other half, they're talking to the therapists. And so I think that the talking to the therapist part is when they're describing what's happening, but they're also, in a way, telling themselves what's happening.
Right.
And I think that anchors it as part of, in a way, the integration process. And I think with group therapy, there'll be less of that opportunity for each person to share.
Yeah.
And there'll be a little bit less of each person's, eyes closed going inward, perhaps because they are listening to what's happening with others. On the other hand, hearing what's happening to others can encourage them to go deeper into themselves.
Yeah.
They can find similar resonances with other people's stories. So we're not quite sure how group therapy is going to work, but we have a big humanitarian project plan. We want to reduce trauma and PTSD all over the world. There's estimates that are years old, but 350 million people with PTSD in the world. The VA estimates 13 million PTSD patients in the US. And there's a lot of countries that have enormous amount of trauma, but don't have psychotherapists and psychiatrists.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to find group models. And I think one of the things that I'm most interested in is actually going to be group models with families. Because when you think about, for example, there's, 4 or 5 million Ukrainian refugees in Poland. And so families are all traumatized at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think when we think about what we're going to try to explore with groups, it could be, giving it with parents and their children. The FDA is requiring us to do adolescent studies if indeed they do give us permission to make MDMA into a prescription medicine for adults. And what that means is 18 years or over, then we must do studies with 13 to 17-year-olds.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I could imagine people listening going, what?
Well, I just received an email from a woman that was describing an underground therapy situation with a 17-year-old who had been very deeply traumatized, and how much it meant to her to feel hope, to feel love, to be able to feel connected. So I think when people think about children and psychedelics, what they're missing, they're coming, many of the listeners, I imagine, coming from the American perspective.
Yeah.
But when you look at the indigenous groups that have successfully integrated psychedelics, like the Native American church with peyote or the ayahuasca churches, they don't have age limits.
Right.
I went to a Native American ceremony, Navajo peyote ceremony, and one of the Navajo man brought his 9-year-old son
Wow.
to spend the night in the teepee. And he took peyote, not as much as the rest of us. He could wander around a little bit more than the rest of us, but it was in a family context, and it can be helpful and integrated that way. And a lot of people in our culture do try psychedelics when they're in high school or, before they're 18 or over. And I think it's the context that really can be supportive or destructive.
Yeah.
But I think this other part, that there's this story about how kids' brains are developing and we have to prevent them from having these experiences until their brains are mature. And that's just like a specious argument in favor of the drug war. We got to protect the kids, because if we're talking particularly about somebody who's traumatized, their brains are already not normal. They're hyper vigilant, they're hyper fearful, their amygdalas hyperactive. So if you can layer in love and spirituality and connection at an earlier age, I think that's a healthy thing. So, I just think if I would have had MDMA at my bar mitzvah when I was 13, I would have had a way better time in high school.
Yeah, we're missing a lot of those rites of passages around that age. And I used to work with at-risk teenagers.
Oh, you did?
And, a lot of those kids were experimenting, but they didn't have the context. And it was really funny because one of those kids at the residential program they ended up in this college class I was teaching. It was the history of psychedelics. And so they got to hear more around the context of it. And I remember they said, wow, I understand all the stories you told me when I was at that treatment center. And it makes so much more sense. I'm looking at it from such a different perspective now than like my friends going out and just, kind of recreating in a way. Like there's this therapeutic use. How can we use it in a different way? So I think it's important.
I think we need honest drug education too.
Yeah.
I mean, when kids are getting educated about drugs these days, it's very fear-based and abstinence-based and misinformation. And a lot of the kids know that, and they're not sure what's really going on.
And which could also be dangerous. Like I definitely talked a lot about testing, and most kids didn't ever think that their drugs were adulterated, right? And especially nowadays, there's so much adulteration in the compounds.
Yeah, and it's much more dangerous now with fentanyl.
Yeah. And so when you said the FDA requires adolescent research, why is that? Is it just because you're bringing a drug to market and you need to see how it...
Well, yes, more and more what's happening is that a lot of drugs that have been tested in adults are never tested in adolescents. And then, like, for example, antidepressants. A lot of antidepressants are given to adolescents. And so there's a lack of information. And so the FDA has required us to file what's called a pediatric plan. And not only are they requiring us to do that, but there's an incentive for doing that, so that MDMA is in the public domain. It was invented by Merck in 1912. The uses of MDMA for PTSD were happening before I even took MDMA in 1982, before I even learned about it. So the use is in the public domain. And so what we're relying on is what's called data exclusivity. So the FDA gives the exclusive use of your data to any sponsor that makes a drug into a medicine that's not patented for 5 years. And that means that generics can't enter. So that's an incentive. Other companies can generate their own data. So that's how it's different than a patent. But that if other companies wanted to generate their own data, they could do that. But that if you do pediatric studies, they give you an additional 6 months of data exclusivity that tacks on at the end when you have the most therapists, the most prescriptions being made. So we're incentivized and required to do work in adolescents. And I think that'll be some of the best work that we ever do. Because if we can help people closer to the trauma, even from an economic point of view, from the insurance companies, the benefits that will happen to younger people by having healed from PTSD over many, many more years, more so than working with somebody who's older.
Right. Yeah. It's harder to change as you get older. And I've noticed that, like, as being a therapist, like I loved working with the younger population versus, because they're just more malleable, right? Like there's just more growth.
Well, you just brought up a really interesting point, which is this idea of critical periods. And so this neuroscientist, Doblin at Hopkins, you may have seen this paper, an article about her work a couple days ago that came out. And the article is about this idea that psychedelics open up a certain neuroplasticity And it's like a critical period. So we know that kids can learn languages a lot easier than adults can.
Yeah.
And so there's something about the brain that is more open, and there's social reward learning, different kind of critical periods at different stages of your life. And so it seems that psychedelics open up these critical periods so that their brains are more malleable and that they can indeed incorporate new kind of information. So if you've got traumatized kids and you can help them with MDMA or something else to have them get over the traumas, that they're able to do that in an easier way. And then there's a lot less suffering. So I think that I'm very much looking for that. So particularly in these humanitarian contexts where you've got whole families that have been traumatized, treating them in groups in a family setting, I think will be really helpful.
And then there's something too around like systems change, right? What happens when one person changes in a system and then the system isn't either educated around that, and there's like that tension that starts to happen. And we talk about this pretty often, but how do we prep systems for that change? Because that could be really jarring. And I've definitely talked to some parents who are like, oh, my child did this psychedelic and now they're just totally different and it's bad. But yeah, can we prep systems a little bit differently?
That's a great point also. So that there's been several studies, the one which was done at Sunstone Therapies in Rockville, Maryland, and they worked with a cancer patient and their partner, and both got MDMA. And also there's a program, a therapeutic approach, cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. Conjoint, again, means couples or dyads, and it's for PTSD, where one person has PTSD and it affects the relationship they're in, and both of them get the MDMA. And that's also been remarkably helpful, better than anything that they were able to achieve without the MDMA. So I think working with couples is... Now, it also raises an interesting point, which is the way that underground therapists most often get in trouble.
Right, yeah.
Is that you think that it would be something goes wrong with the therapy and then the patient complains, but it's not like that. It's the opposite. It's something goes right with the therapy and then somebody wants to make a change and then their community or their partner doesn't follow along in that change and they get upset and then they complain. So this systems approach is very important.
Going back to, we were talking about adolescence. We're recording on Father's Day, so happy Father's Day.
Oh, thank you.
Being in this field, being a leader, how do you talk about psychedelics to, kids? And I'm sure there's a lot of parents that have this interest in it. And, how do you talk about this in a responsible way?
Well, I think that, again, this honest drug education and that the context is what's important. So I think what the first piece of the way my wife and I tried to talk to our kids about it was to help them understand that it's not the substance itself, it's the relationship you have with it.
Yeah.
And whether you use it responsibly, whether you're respecting it, whether you understand what it does. And so we actually, when each of our kids had their bar mitzvah or their bat mitzvah, we offered them MDMA or marijuana if they wanted to do it with us.
Yeah.
We did not realize that was the best possible anti-drug strategy to say, oh, come do it with your parents. They all said,
like, no way.
No way. We're not ready. Forget about it. They sort of changed their mind afterwards. But I think what you need to do is just be honest with them and say that these experiences, people... How do you teach kids about alcohol? We have a horrible situation where, it's illegal and then until they're 21 and nobody follows that. And then they do it without parental supervision and without guidance. And I was even told when our kids were in high school that if we were to offer a safe place for our kids and their friends to drink alcohol, that we would be prosecuted.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just incredible the way that we do this. So I think with kids, they're hungry for real information. And when you tell them that, I think they'll respect the risks. There are risks and there are advantages. And I think, just be honest with the kids.
We need definitely better drug education. And I think... who was that? Drug Policy Alliance was coming up with some of that stuff.
They had Safety First. And Marsha Rosenbaum did a lot of work on that. Some of the programs that are still being taught to adolescents are filled with misinformation.
Yeah.
But I think that when you think about these rites of passage, that when you're an adolescent or early in college, those are the ripe times for people to sort of explore who are they, where do they fit into the larger world.
Yeah.
I think in many indigenous cultures, that's the time of initiation for a lot of people. So I think we have hurt ourselves tremendously. Now, you hear this always about marijuana, like, oh, kids should, developing brains and they should never try marijuana. And I think the thing is that overuse is a problem. If, daily use before you go to school, all of that is a problem, makes it difficult to learn things like that. But we tend to make sweeping statements like never use.
Right.
And
instead of like a more intentional use that's like maybe in a ceremonial context and for a certain purpose.
Yeah, I think that. And so I think what we'll see is as we develop what we anticipate will be thousands and thousands of psychedelic clinics with therapists cross-trained in all the different ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin, 5-MeO, DMT, all the different modalities, that there'll be a different kind of education seeping into the culture about context, about how that these substances that people have only thought about in terms of party context, that they have therapeutic potential. So even when kids go out to party with their friends, and if they take these, let's say they take MDMA or quote ecstasy or Molly or whatever in a party context, when stuff difficult comes up, they don't automatically know this is an opportunity to work through it, to face it, and that you should be easier because of the way the drug works, easier to process those emotions. And instead, it starts to get difficult and they think, oh, this is a bad trip, and they try to shut it down and run away from it. So I think the therapeutic context and more of those kind of therapeutic stories will seep through the culture and help people understand that these tools can be used in these very productive ways.
Yeah. And things are changing, it seems like, very rapidly. Quick question. I wanted to go back to the therapy training. Yeah. I know you were part of the first cohort of holotropic breathwork facilitators. Yes. And, that is kind of like a controversial topic. Does somebody need to take a substance to get, specific training in MDMA or psilocybin? Do you think breathwork could be an alternative?
No.
Why is that?
No, I think breathwork is great in itself. We have Stan Groff and Brigitte are here at the conference, and he's 91 years old now. It's incredible. We've got, I think, 240 people doing breathwork. Breathwork is an incredible technique. And what it demonstrates is that you don't need exterior substances to catalyze a lot of these flow into consciousness, that hyperventilation is a tool that can be used in that way. But it's different than MDMA. And so people have also talked about ketamine. Since ketamine is now legally available for depression, can you train MDMA therapists with ketamine? And I think that's, again, it's useful to understand what ketamine is like, what non-ordinary states of consciousness are like, but it's not the same.
Different process, different protocol.
Yeah, and MDMA is fundamentally different. It's more interactive. It's
which you wouldn't be getting during breath work, right? You're just sitting there and somebody's having their own experience, and there's not much of that engagement.
Yeah, breath work is really like more like LSD or psilocybin than MDMA is.
Right.
So I think that people, in the absence of opportunities legally to experience MDMA as part of their training to become an MDMA therapist, learning breath work is very helpful. And in fact, we have used breath work in some of our therapy training programs.
Yeah.
And it's been really helpful to sort of drop people into a deeper emotional level and to understand how these experiences are within us. So I think that's one of the main things that the breathwork demonstrates is the experience is not in the pill.
Yeah.
It's not in the psychedelic. The psychedelic releases experiences that are within our psyche. And you can do that with breathwork. You can do that with meditation. There's all different ways that you can do it, but that the most reliable, frequent way is often to take a substance or to do the breathwork or something. So I do think that it's going to be a major point of going forward is for us to strongly recommend that MDMA therapists have their own MDMA experience.
Yeah.
But again, never require it. Yeah. It's always optional. But and I'm not quite sure why it's so controversial. I mean, it doesn't.
Maybe it's because of just our perception of illegal substances still. And,
Yeah, it's like, they're taking it because they don't have a diagnosis.
That too.
But we do have FDA approval for a protocol to give MDMA. We're learning about self-compassion, but it's limited to therapists.
Yeah.
But it's very, very expensive to do those kind of studies when there's all sorts of data gathering. And also, even though we have that permission for that study, we're not going to be implementing it. And that's why we're going to have this Numinous in Canada and New Mind in Bahamas, and hopefully other places will do that eventually, Jamaica. Because right now, if you want to work with psilocybin, to be a psilocybin therapist, you can go to Jamaica, you can go to Costa Rica, you can go to the Netherlands. There are legal places, because people have this kind of romantic notion, if it's from nature, it's great, and if it's from synthetic, then it's a problem. So a lot of the initiatives that have, like here we are in Colorado, the Natural Plant Medicine Initiative passed, and that's starting with psilocybin, but then it's going to expand to ibogaine and to ayahuasca and to mescaline, but not from peyote, from San Pedro. And so, but when you add synthetic like MDMA, then it wouldn't have passed the initiative.
Yeah. Which is sad that it's so focused on, more of those natural. But I get it. Sometimes it's like the perception of it seems maybe a little less risky if it's not.
Yes.
But didn't they sign a bill here in Colorado that once it becomes approved, I think Colorado had that certain bill that they needed to actually write that into law? Yeah.
So what happens is once the FDA says that if they do say that MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD is approved as a prescription medicine, then the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, has 90 days to reschedule it, to take it out of Schedule 1. And then half the states automatically reschedule, according to the feds, but another half don't. And there's various different things. And Colorado was one of the ones that didn't, and it needed a new law.
Okay.
And so we did pass that law here that if MDMA becomes rescheduled federally, then it will automatically become rescheduled here. In New York, we did something better, which is that we made New York like half the other states, so that if anything gets rescheduled, so then by the feds, then it gets rescheduled in New York. And so I think that we have to realize, as what MAPS and the MAPS Public Benefit are doing, is we're not just trying to make MDMA into a medicine, we're trying to help the entire field. So our default should be, let us try in these other states. California is another state that has to have a law passed that would permit MDMA or any other scheduled drug. If it's rescheduled, a law has to be passed. So what we're trying to do is to make it so that all drugs get rescheduled following the feds. And I think we have to be careful that the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation doesn't interpret its mission to be so narrow that it's just about us, that it's just about MDMA. Because really what we're trying to do is, in the public benefit, is bring forth psychedelic medicine. And we want to empower therapists to be cross-trained in all the different substances, and then customize a treatment program for each individual patient.
Right.
And so at some point, a patient might benefit the most from psilocybin or 5-MeO, and we don't want to say, only MDMA for those people. And I think one of the reasons why this conference has been so successful and why there's astonishing 11,500 people registered.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Is that people perceive us as really trying to help the entire field.
Yeah.
And that's why we've been able to sort of coalesce the community here. And that's what we want to continue to do. So I think in our efforts to do this rescheduling, our first default should be, how do we make it automatic for everything? And that's actually going to be good for our business model too. It's not that we need to channel people, just everybody to MDMA.
Are you guys going to look at other psychedelics once MDMA gets approved, or if it gets approved?
Yeah, I think so. I think first off, there's going to be a lot of other uses of MDMA other than PTSD.
Yeah.
And I think one of the early ones is going to be eating disorders.
Right.
But there's a lot of other uses, I think, that would be.
Yeah, we're just in the beginning of really trying to find all this stuff out, right? All right. Well, I think we're getting at time here.
That's pretty funny.
Anything you want to close with for today? Well,
I just want to say that I think the podcast that you're doing, that is so important because we are gathering a lot of the data and the data is looking good. And so what I think we really need is public education.
Yeah.
And for people to understand that there's the possibility of FDA approval and that there's also the possibility of state level reforms in different ways, and that we want to make it so that as much as possible, people get the best experiences. And in particular, when it's difficult, that they understand that difficult is not the same as bad.
Yeah.
And that don't try to suppress it, because this is precious. The world is on fire. The humanity is the rise of authoritarianism and climate change. And there's a lot of fearful things happening. And when fearful things happen, people tend to close down and they tend to be more easily manipulated by unscrupulous politicians. And so I think we really need to try to do this mainstreaming of psychedelics in a way there's not a backlash. And in order to do that, we really need trained therapists and understanding in the population. So I think the podcast and all the ways that you're doing to try to educate people are really important. And I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, is just trying to shift the public perception, right? And like try to break some of that stigma, because I think that's still something we're battling up against. I feel like we're definitely in a bubble, and it's like, a lot of people around me are really excited, but there's a lot of people out there that are still kind of fearful.
I think there's people that still think MDMA causes holes in your brain.
Yeah.
Or LSD damages your chromosomes, and a lot of the fear is actually fear of what's in us. Fear of the suppressed anxieties and traumas and urges that people are scared of.
Yeah.
And we need to find a way to help people process them. Yeah. Oh, I guess I would like to add one thing more, which is that what we've done for the longest time with MAPS is that, because we've needed so much money, we have tended to focus on the major donor strategy, but what we'd really like to do is build the base. We have 11,500 people registered here, but we only have a few thousand annual donors.
Right.
So we'd really like to encourage people to become members of MAPS and to help us do a lot of the drug policy reform and the harm reduction and the health equity work and all the other things that we're trying to do through the nonprofit.
So if you're listening, please donate. And then actually also, you had some news that you just got a $5 million grant from the Stephen and Alexandra Foundation, right?
The Cohen Foundation. Yes. And what's the tremendous about that grant is that because we have been offering funds to investors, different opportunities. We had a royalty share agreement and raised $43 million through what we call the Vine deal with Ryan Zura, which was tremendous. It was tremendous. But what the Cohen Foundation said is that they would make this $5 million donation as if it was part of the royalty share. But instead of the royalties that we would give back to them, that we have to use that for patient assistance programs, which is tremendous.
That's amazing. Yeah, because we all know accessibility is going to be an issue, right?
Yeah. And so, what we didn't talk about yet was insurance coverage and how likely it is. But it seems like the value of helping someone overcome their PTSD is tremendous because it can be so debilitating. So we do think that we have a very good chance of starting right off with insurance coverage.
Oh, amazing.
It's not confirmed yet, but we're hopeful about that. And yet there's going to be a lot of people that don't have insurance. And often the people that don't have insurance are the ones that are the most traumatized.
Yeah.
So the Cohen Foundation donation is a donation as if it were an investment, but that the return would go to patient assistance. So it's tremendous what Alex and Stephen Cohen have done in that way. And we hope that inspires others to donate in that way.
Well, if you're listening, you have the money to give, please give to MAPS.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Rick. Really appreciate it.
Great. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Rick Doblin. Huge shout out to the MAPS team, everybody that played a role in putting on Psychedelic Science. Huge shout out to Rick for taking time out of his busy and hectic schedule to sit down and chat with Psychedelics Today so he could provide some updates around what's been going on with MAPS, the $5 million grant from the Cohen Foundation, the Patient Access Fund, giving us updates on the phase 3 studies, and the future of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So hopefully we get to see MDMA-assisted therapy as a treatment for PTSD in the future. Hopefully, fingers crossed for that 2024 date. And yeah, if you haven't been following MAPS, definitely go check them out. MAPS.org, considering donating so they can continue with their work. And so we can see MDMA as an approved treatment. If you have any questions, comments, anything like that, feel free to send us an email, info@psychedelicstoday.com. And again, as a reminder, be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts and follow us on social media so you can keep up to date with what we're up to and announcements and news and all those great things. So with that, I hope you are having a beautiful and lovely day whenever you're listening to this episode, and we will catch you on the next episode of Psychedelics Today.